Hi, Josiah. This is Ira, and I'm sharing with you here my voice feedback on your statement of belief. My hope is that these notes will be useful as you move from the statement of belief to your defining good argument and digital context essay. So I'll just jump right in. I really enjoyed reading this piece. I think I think of it kind of as a pay-on to dialogue, the Socratic character of it is really nice. So what I want to do in responding to it is not offer criticism of this, but rather offer some questions really that I think will be useful in pushing yourself on to the next thing. So when we talk about what argument is for, and you say, depending on one's hermeneutical approach, the aforementioned description of debate may be completely acceptable. However, your belief is that any sort of discourse arriving from conflicting ideas serves the purpose of synthesizing multiple ideas into a single concept that more accurately grasps universal truths. So obviously a strong and highly particular definition of argument, but I think it's one that you're, of course, totally warranted in having as a conclusion you've reached about what you want argument to be for. I'm curious whether when you say you believe that any sort of discourse arriving from conflicting ideas does serve that purpose, or whether you believe that it should serve that purpose. So in other words, I'm a little curious about whether you see that as how the world literally is, or whether you see that as how the world ought to be. So I'd be interested to see you elaborate a little bit more on why you think the world is like that, which many people would disagree, and also why you think the world ought to be like that, which people would also disagree. So as you're moving into the argument for your position, I'd be interested to see you articulate again a little more clearly whether you see that as an is or an ought, and some of the rationales that you think other people might find compelling for why we also ought to see that as an is or an ought. Cool. So, and that's because, and I think part of why that's interesting in this context to do that is because you're counterposing that search for truth with arguing simply and exclusively to persuade, which I mean actually I'm broadly on board with. Not that I need to be anyways for the paper, but just so you know, I'm not saying this because I think it's wrong or bad, but rather because I want to encourage you to really think about this in the next paper. This view of argument as truth seeking, as a case to be made, as a case to be offered to people who may not agree with that. By the way, when you talk about dialectic as thesis and antithesis conjoined in synthesis, just know that for Hegel at least, the synthesis will always still carry up inside of it that opposition. In other words, so conjoined is a perfectly reasonable way of saying that. But in other words, the synthesis, certainly in the Hegelian uptake of the dialectical tradition, is still riven within itself by that opposing thesis and antithesis. And I'm also going to note, coming a little bit later on, that in fact Socrates, as Plato gives him to us, isn't quite as committed all the time to this view as we tend to think he is. But that's for later in the paper. So your focus is on dialogue, and I'd be interested to see you say more about whether dialogue is something that kind of has to happen face to face, and it's automatically diminished. And there's a couple of moments where you sort of suggest that that's the case, or whether it's viable for dialogue to be mediated and multilateral, as it often is, obviously, in digital contexts. I mean, it's mediated by definition, and often multilateral. And you also, in a couple of moments, suggest that that might be okay. So I'd be interested to see you saying more about whether the dialogic view of argument that you're putting forward is amenable to multilaterality, and whether it's amenable to mediation, and why or why not. I thought your view of how to enter into debate with people who would seem to have nothing to offer is really a generous and engaging and interesting one. There's this kind of vaguely Rawlsian veil of ignorance in your disregard of background. And this notion that if one person does have nothing to contribute, then the discourse must be amicably terminated, but that in essence we owe it to one another in some way to start with an open mind and a disregard of background and effort to enter into dialogue with one another. So I think that's lovely, but also I'd like to see you articulate a little bit more why. Why should we be doing that? Moreover, with regard to those unqualified and those quote-unquote evil, relative to argument, what makes somebody unqualified or what makes somebody evil relative to argument? There's not yet a strong sense of that here, and so that'd be something I'd be interested to see you develop a little more fully. In other words, a little bit fuller set of criteria for judgment that are rooted in your definition. And so then here you come to actually some of what Plato writes about in the Phaedrus and Derrida writes about in Plato's Pharmacy, which is the what Plato sort of saw, although Derrida shows that it's not quite as simple as that, as the corrupting role of the medium. And you see this as a problem, the impersonality of dialogue, the asynchronous character of it. So Plato, as you know, wrote about that in the Phaedrus as a pharmakon, both poison and a drug. It's the word we get pharmacy from. And so, i.e. both poison and cure. And he was talking about writing in general, as you are here, and you're saying that it's a more prominent difficulty with the internet. I'd be interested to hear you say more about exactly why you see that as a difficulty for your vision of dialogic argument. Why is mediation a problem for argument as dialogue, as far as you understand it? You talk about that a little bit in terms of the difficulty of acquiring and maintaining compassion in mediated contexts. But I wonder a little bit about that, since after all, we often have great compassion for characters in a novel. We can weep while reading a novel. In fact, are sometimes much more compassionate for characters in a novel than we are for one another in dialogue. William James wrote about that in his famous essay on Habit. He talks about the Russian noblewoman crying at the theater at the plight of the poor in the theater, while outside her coachman freezes, waiting for her, with her never thinking about that. The point being, we're sometimes much more empathetically attuned to mediated representations of human experience than we are to the direct human experience that we would otherwise be entering into dialogue with. And so I'd be interested to hear you say more about how that does or doesn't cash out in digital contexts. Now, I'd also be interested to hear you say more about how we facilitate candidness. I think that's a really interesting question for your particular view of argument in digital contexts. Is a question of how can something like honesty, how can an open sincerity, how can candidness about our positions be fostered? Maybe by the context that we're in, but maybe by our own attitude. How do we do, in other words, this whole kind of collection of things that you urge? And then finally, I want to kind of challenge you a little bit on your final thoughts. Certainly, argument and persuasion should not be understood as identical, and I think your sense that a good argument doesn't really require persuasion is fair enough. I'm curious when you say that persuasion actually detracts from the goodness of an argument. If we're searching for truth, isn't persuasion our vehicle for getting there? And you offer Socrates debating Thrasymachus as self-understanding rather than persuading the opponent, which is fair enough, but you can also look all through most of the rest of the dialogues and see an awful lot of Socrates trying to persuade people. So the Gorgias, for instance, is all about Socrates trying to persuade the sophists, and he has some uncharacteristically long dialogues in the process. So I'm not, and even in a much smaller way, there's in virtually every dialogue, there's a solid chunk of Socrates asking somebody a question, often one of his acolytes, and the acolyte saying, "Yes, it is just so, Socrates. It is just as you say. Indeed, Socrates. If you say so, Socrates," so on and so forth. The point being that for the argument to continue in Socratic fashion, it's necessary for the interlocutor to accept premises and arguments in an ongoing fashion, which seems to me like something like that is persuasion. So I'm curious why you see that detracting from the goodness of argument on the whole, if it's necessary for the argument to move forward. All right. Well, so those are some of my immediate responses to this. Again, really interesting statement of belief, really thoughtful and engaging. And I look forward to reading you again soon and to talking more as we go forward. I hope you won't hesitate to reach out and come see me in office hours, make an appointment to talk about the next project and the next. Have a good day. Talk to you soon. Bye.